complimentary as well. So thanks to Lax and the team over there. Thing number 4, Gary, as we move on in this week's version of the 5 things, going back to inflation, the 2% inflation target is random and unchanged.
Yeah. So where we got the idea for this tweet, one of the for this thing, as I was on Twitter or X, one of my favorite follows there is Dario Perkins. It's at Dario Perkins, and he put up what I thought was a very funny economics tweet. Yeah, it's the economic hilarity episode, but it's the chart. It's a chart for the United States inflation target rate, which has been 2% for decades. And so it's this chart with just a flat line.
Yeah, it's a great
across,
chart.
right? And so, the whole thing, if you're into economics and economic history, right, it made some of us laugh. And I thought it was a very funny tweet by Dario. But it brought to mind this really interesting question that people have asked: where did this 2% inflation target come from? And it's actually almost 40 years ago, a New Zealand finance minister was being questioned on television. And somebody asked him, what's your estimate for a sustainable and healthy rate of inflation? And the guy, he wasn't expecting the question. Nobody had really thought about it. And he started stammering, had difficulty answering the question, and eventually just kind of blurted out 1%. And, the report of it kind of implies like 1%, like he was making it up as he was going on. And then that later, a couple of years later, got adjusted by some other people in the finance department to 2%. And then that number got adopted by central banks. And it's been the number for decades. But basically, one guy in a small country on TV blurts out a number that some flunky in the back office adjusts later. And now every central bank around the world is using this like it's a real thing. And so it actually made Dario's tweet even funnier, because we're graphing something that's always unchanged, but it's not just that it's unchanged. It's a random number. It was randomly made up by a guy.
The disagreement, Gary, that you talked about a little bit in the 5 things too, is that the inflation theft issue, and some people thinking that will actually have more economic growth with higher inflation. Why do you disagree with those people?
Yeah. So look, I've had this argument with people for years, and some of you listening to this are going to disagree. If you do, great, put it in the comments, right? But tell me why you disagree. Here's the issue. A lot of people claim that without inflation, we'd have a stagnant economy. That basically inflation produces economic growth, because if people know that prices are going to go up, it incentivizes us to go out and consume now. And that if we had flat prices or decreasing prices, nobody would spend money. The whole economy would stall. And that's generally the argument as it's presented to me, to which I claim that is complete nonsense. Here's why. What I did was, I did research. So I called our college student and intern, Andrew Brown, and I went through. I said, Andrew, let me guess what you spend your money. He's like, yeah, go ahead. I'm like, well, so tuition. He's at the University of Tennessee. He's like, yep. I said, your, room and board, either an apartment or a dorm. He says, yep. I said, food. He said, yep. Car payment, auto insurance. He's like, oh yeah, I have to have that. I said, I'm guessing the most valuable thing you have in your dorm room is the computer you have for school. He says, yeah, you nailed it. I said, okay, well, of those items, right? What percent of your annual spending does that cover? He says, pretty close to 100%,
Yeah.
right? So let me ask you, right? For the people who argue that we need inflation to have economic growth, and without inflation, people would have no incentive to spend, what would he wait for? So would he not house himself or pay for an education or have a computer for school or feed himself or have a car because these items might be cheaper next year? Of course not. And in fact, one of the most interesting things in the United States, at least, one of the greatest consumer growth industries over the last 40, 50 years has been in electronics. And every year, computing power gets cheaper. Cell phones get more powerful, right? And the older ones become cheaper, right? Whatever cell phone you have in your pocket Try to buy that cell phone in a year. It'll be a lot cheaper, right?
Yeah.
Televisions. I mean, I remember the first time I bought a high def TV, it was one of the 1080p ones, 40 inches. The thing weighed 40 pounds. It was $1,500. Now you can go to Best Buy and buy a 55-inch 4K TV that weighs 4 pounds. Those things are $300, right? But nobody says, I'm not going to buy a TV. I'm not going to buy a computer. The truth is that people do buy the things that they want. And most of our spending, for most of us, right? Housing, food, cars. These are things that people are not going without. Nobody says, I'm going to live on the street because I'll be able to rent cheaper next year. So I just don't buy these arguments. On top of that, the real issue with inflation is it represents theft by the government, right? When you have a loss of purchasing power, right? Think about it. Think about the things that you would buy 10 years ago or your grocery bill. And now the same amount of money doesn't buy you the same amount. The purchasing power of your dollar declines every year. Where does that value go? The truth is it's called seniorage. And it is being that value is being stolen by the government. And you think, okay, well, what is 2% a big deal? Right? I was going to buy a candy bar for $1. Next year it'd be $1 Who cares? Well, over a 40-year working life, we talked about this before. A 2% inflation rate robs you of 55% of the value